Have you felt that shot of adrenaline when you see the red lights behind you, police car? Or that sense of relief as it passes by you? Or maybe not. But regardless of how we feel about speed limits, think for a minute, what is the intention of the speed limit laws? What is the underlying principle behind them? Well, it's safety, isn't it? It lets people get where they need to go without hopefully killing anybody in the process. On the highway, most of us know that we can probably go 5 to 10 kilometers faster than the posted limit and probably not get bothered. But if you're in a school zone with kids wandering around, we don't have that kind of leeway. So why not? Because the safety factor is different. The principle behind the rule, behind the law, is being violated, the safety. So what is the intention, the underlying principle behind God's laws, behind His commandments? Do we sometimes concentrate so hard on the letter of the law, on the details, that we miss the bigger principles behind why it's there in the first place? I think often we do. And Jesus deals with that in today's passage from Luke 6, 1 to 11. And He helps us see that through God's commandments, what the bigger picture of what God is wanting, the bigger picture of who God is. So just a bit of background. As we've been going through the book of Luke, the author has been using each thing that happens to further showing us the understanding of who Jesus is and what His mission is when He was here on earth. Back in chapter 4, 31 to 37, Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath day, but He didn't get any criticism for it. But now the reports of what Jesus has been doing are spreading throughout the whole country, and now the religious leaders come and start checking Him out. Jesus does deal with some negative criticism by these religious leaders in chapter 5. But now in chapter 6, they start to oppose Him directly. In Luke 6, 1 to 11, Jesus deals with the religious leaders and the whole society's view of what the Sabbath day is and how it should be kept. But what it really boils down to is what is the bigger principle behind God's laws. And so we'll start reading verses 1 and 2, and we're introduced to the action of Jesus and the criticism that He gets. Luke 6, 1 and 2. On a Sabbath, while He was going through the grain fields, His disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" Now in our culture, being criticized for picking grain and rubbing it in your hands and eating it just doesn't make sense. But in that day, you were wandering around through a field and you had some ripe grain, you would do that and you would eat because you'd be hungry. So why was this a problem for them? What was the issue? Well, we need to understand some things about God's law and how the Pharisees, the Jewish religious leaders, interpreted and taught that law. So first of all, what is the Sabbath? This could be really long and complicated, but I'll try and keep it short and simple. I'm actually going to post a longer teaching segment on this, probably on Tuesday. So if you have questions about the Sabbath, I'll deal with them there. But for now, the Sabbath is based on the creation week, when God created the universe and our world in 6 literal days, 6-day time period, and then ceased from that creating work and rested on the 7th day. God set apart that 7th day, Saturday, but made no comment at that time about the need to do anything differently, to stop working or anything like that, until the time of Moses, when the people of Israel left Egypt. And at that time, God made a covenant, which is a promise, an agreement with the nation of Israel. Now, I emphasize nation because the covenant was between God and that people group, that nation alone, Israel. It's a covenant, a promise that God would be the God of those people and that they would serve Him and serve God alone. In that covenant, God made promises to Israel and gave conditions that Israel had to keep. The 10 Commandments are the basis of that covenant. That's what some of the things they were based on that they had to keep. And the Sabbath is the sign of that covenant. It's a distinctive thing Israel does to show that they are keeping God's covenant. And that's clearly stated that it's a sign of the covenant in Exodus 31 and Ezekiel 20. And again, if you want to hear more about that, go to my special teaching segment on that. So in those places, though, God is talking about Israel and how they are to know that they are God's people. They belong to Him. So the Sabbath really doesn't apply to non-Jews. And the people of the day knew that, which is why it was never an issue in the book of Acts, nor was it applied to the Christian church. The basic idea of the Sabbath, though, was to rest on the seventh day, on the Saturday, like God did when He rested from the work that He was doing in creating the world. God gave some regulations to restrict what they did on that day. But the basic idea was to not work, to rest from your normal employment, whatever that was. It was a time to celebrate, a time to rest and consider the goodness of God, to worship God. So when we understand the principle behind the law, did the disciples do anything wrong? Well, by the regulations God gave to Moses, no, they didn't. But by the regulations that the religious leaders taught and the society's general practice, yes, they did do something wrong. The rabbinical teaching on the Sabbath day, the rabbis were the religious teachers of the day, they had added extra things. They excluded all kinds of activities and added more regulations. But you see, God had made a distinction way back between plucking grain and harvesting it, about this very action the disciples did in Deuteronomy 23:25. He said, if you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain. There's a big difference between walking through somebody's grain field and plucking a few heads of grain and rubbing them and eating them, as opposed to getting out the sickle. Well, that's getting out the combine in those days. That's harvesting. And God says, don't do that. It doesn't belong to you. But plucking something on your way by, that is just fine. Now, the rabbis didn't make that distinction. For what reason, we don't know. The bottom line is that many regulations were added to what God had set out. And what should have been a joyful day, a restful day, became a burdensome day when you had to think about all the different things that you couldn't do and try not to do them. And it missed the whole idea of the Sabbath. And Jesus is dealing with this. He's dealing with their teaching and the whole situation there. So when we come to verses 3 to 5, we see the answer of Jesus. And Jesus gives an Old Testament example, and he shows what is the bigger principle of the law. Now you need to know a little bit of background to what Jesus is referring to. And now, if we've been reading through our Bible chronologically, we would have just read this just a couple weeks ago. What the situation was is that Saul is still the king of Israel, and David is one of his lieutenants. And David was so successful that Saul became jealous, and he wanted to kill David. So David fled. He ran for his life. And in doing so, he didn't take the provisions he probably should have. He was in a hurry. He had to get going. And so he comes to the house of God. And this is the situation that Jesus is referring to. So Luke 6, verses 3 to 5. And Jesus answered them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those with him. And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So Jesus brings to the attention of the Pharisees something they should know. He starts off by saying, have you not read? Well, they would have read it, but what he was getting at is you didn't understand what you were reading. The bread that was in the tabernacle, in the house of God, was not supposed to be eaten by anybody else but the priests. That was part of the ceremonial law. But the priests made an exception because of the human need, the hunger that David and his men had. Jesus is stating a principle that ceremony should not come before human need. The ceremonial law of the tabernacle had been put in place by God for a reason. But what is the underlying principle behind God's laws? It lies in God himself, in who he is. He's a righteous, holy, and just God. But he's also a loving and merciful God. And Jesus put the underlying principle of the laws in the Old Testament like this. This was in another place, in another occasion, but the principles are the same. This is from Matthew 22, verses 36 to 40. Jesus is asked by somebody, "Teacher, what is the great commandment of the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." So essentially what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees is that the law of the Sabbath, the law of the tabernacle, is trumped first by loving God. That's the first thing. And then secondly, by the principle of love your neighbor as yourself. These are more important. These are the most important things. So in Matthew's account of this same story, so we're reading Luke, the story where they had taken the grain and eaten it and got criticized, and Jesus tells the story of David. In this same story in the book of Matthew, Jesus also adds this explanation in Matthew 12:7. He said, "If you had known what this means, 'I desire mercy and not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the guiltless." So here, Jesus is quoting Hosea 6:6 to underline the principle that to have mercy on a person in need is a higher principle than keeping the details of the sacrificial law. Notice that it's the ceremonial aspects of the law of Moses that Jesus is dealing with here. The parts that will be done away with after the sacrifice of Christ. The moral standards of God, to not lie, to not steal, to commit murder, to covet, etc. That's part of who God is. That's part of his righteousness, and that always stays the same. And that's why all of those things, those moral things, are repeated again in the New Testament, while the ceremonial laws, the sacrifices, temple worship, and the Sabbath are not repeated. But our obedience to God, and that obedience should demonstrate and should look like God's righteous character, it's not just what we don't do. It's also seen in what we do, showing mercy, compassion, and loving our fellow humans. And this is the big part that the Pharisees were missing. And this is what we don't want to miss either. We don't want to miss having mercy, compassion, and love for our fellow people, for our fellow humans. And never get lost in just following the rules, whatever that may mean, for whatever reason that we would do that. And Jesus adds one more thing in that section that I read in Luke 6, verse 5, that really would have blown the minds of the Pharisees. He added one more little sentence right at the end of his explanation. Jesus said, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Now he calls himself two things here, and both of them are pretty loaded with meaning. The first is Son of Man. Now he used this term back in 524 when he made another astounding claim that he could forgive sin on behalf of God, and he called himself the Son of Man. Now forgiving sin is only something God can do. Now the Son of Man is a term from Daniel 7:13, and it refers to the everlasting King sent from God. In other words, the Messiah, the Christ. It's who he was claiming to be. And Jesus used that term for himself. Now in my sermon in Luke 5, verses 12 to 27, it explains more about Son of Man. And if you're unsure about that, go back and listen there and you'll get a little more information on that term and what it really means. But the second term that Jesus uses is the Lord of the Sabbath. And that's an even more provocative claim to authority. Because when you think about that, who instituted the Sabbath? God at creation and also with Moses gave those commands. So what does that tell you about what Jesus was claiming? That he's God, that he's the creator, and therefore he can determine what is appropriate to do on the Sabbath day. That was his point. I mean, wow, can you imagine if I came along and said that I had that kind of authority? I'd be nuts, obviously. But Jesus is not nuts. He's not crazy. He has that kind of authority. And he is the creator, and he is God. And Jesus is trying to show all the people the truth about God. That he cares more about the kind of attitude that you have an attitude in keeping with who God is, with his nature. Because if you do have the right attitude, your actions will show it. But you can have right actions and you can have an attitude of rebellion against God. And we're going to see that later as we get to the next section from Luke 6. In verses 6 to 11, Jesus makes it even more clear what this attitude should be. Here, the attitude of Jesus defines further the bigger principle of the law. I'm going to read from Luke 6, verses 6 to 7. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. Well, the religious leaders obviously didn't get the point. They didn't get the message about the Sabbath. But they knew Jesus well enough that he probably would want to heal this guy. So they were watching him. They were out to get Jesus. I'll continue on in verses 6 to 8. But he knew their thoughts, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to destroy it?" And after looking around at them all, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. Now Luke, the narrator, gives us some detail that Jesus knew their thoughts. Just a little detail, but pretty important. It shows again that Jesus is God. No one else could know someone's thoughts. And he had the authority, because of that, to say and do the things that he did. So Jesus deals with the situation head on. He asked the man to come up. And Jesus asked, so what's the right thing to do on the Sabbath day? And what he says is just ridiculously common sense. And he points to what is the heart of God? Doing good? Saving life? Or do you think God would prefer you to harm life and destroy it? I mean, come on. The rabbinical tradition that was taught at that time about the Sabbath was that medical help could not be given unless it was a life-threatening situation. The guy with the withered hand can wait. Let him wait till Sunday. So Jesus hits them head on, essentially saying, think about it, guys. Use your heads. Now, in Matthew's account, again, of this same story, Jesus also adds something else in Matthew 12, 11, and 12. He said to them, "Which of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, would not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Jesus uses just good old common sense to show what the heart of God would be in that situation, by showing them what their own actions would do if they were in that situation. They would take the sheep and lift it out. And people are made in the image of God, and so they are far more valuable than an animal. God is far more concerned with showing mercy, compassion, and love to people than to be worried about the details of following rules, which weren't even from God in that case. But these were added by men, and it went against the principle behind God's laws. For Jesus, and obviously for God, every day, including the Sabbath, is a good day to save a life, to do good. He restores the man's hand in front of everyone. Jesus' mission on earth was to restore damaged people who are part of God's creation, who are made in God's image. His ability to restore people physically was to show that he could do the same thing spiritually in our lives. God's heart, God's desire is to restore people to a right relationship with him. All of us have been born with and act on the desire to do what we want and to exclude other people. We desire to do what's pleasing to us at the expense of others and also the expense of God. And that's what God calls sin. And it breaks and it damages our relationship with God. Now, we do fight that at times, but that is our natural tendency. God, the righteous judge, determined that this sin deserves punishment. It deserves death. And Jesus came to restore our relationship with God by paying the penalty himself, by dying on the cross in our place, taking the punishment of God on himself, and then, of course, rose 3 days later. showing that God was satisfied, that the payment was finished. The punishment was dealt with, and new life could be given to those who believe in Jesus. If we turn from our sin and ask God to forgive us because of Jesus' death and resurrection, God will forgive us and restore us to a proper relationship with himself. The bottom line is the heart of God. Yes, God is a just God. He must punish sin. But in his mercy, compassion, and love for people, he sent Jesus to show this mercy in his life, in the life of Jesus, and in his actions, in his teachings, and ultimately, of course, in his death for us on the cross. God's heart and God's desire for us as people is to live in the same way as Jesus did. Being like God in what we do, having that same heart, showing this to those people who are around us, his mercy, his compassion, and his love. And by sharing with them the good news of Jesus Christ. And, of course, giving practical help when we see needs and doing something about it. When our motivations are like what Jesus demonstrated, we have God's heart for other people. But the religious leaders didn't get it. In verse 11, the authority of Jesus is rejected. Verse 11, but they, that's the Pharisees again, were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. So imagine the scene. This man had just come up, he'd been healed, he'd been made whole, he'd been healthy. The people watching were amazed, they were joyful, they were praising God for what he did and how wonderful he was. And the Pharisees were furious at the goodness of God and at what Jesus did, this good thing for this man. In Mark's account of this same story, it says that the Pharisees discussed how they might destroy him, how they might kill Jesus. So did these leaders believe what Jesus was saying? Did they accept his common sense argument, the bigger principle of God's law? No, obviously they didn't. Did the leaders believe who Jesus was? That he was the Son of Man, that he was the Lord of the Sabbath, that Jesus could tell them with authority what was appropriate to do on the Sabbath day? No, they definitely didn't believe that either. They totally rejected what Jesus taught and who he said he was. It was more important for them to keep their extra legalistic details than to recognize God's love for people, and for themselves for that matter. And the sad part is the Pharisees missed the presence of God in Jesus Christ for the sake of their rules. They missed the truth of what God was teaching, and that they continued to live their lives in just bitter legalism. And eventually, they became responsible for the death of Jesus. The Pharisees missed the mercy and compassion of Jesus as he healed the man. They missed God's love for people for the sake of their rules again. The Pharisees missed being able to rejoice with the man and give God praise for his goodness. They missed glorifying God for the sake of their rules. It's pretty sad, isn't it? But at the same rate, if we don't live our lives focused on the true heart of God, we can miss these same things ourselves. We can miss the truth of who God is and of who Jesus is. If our ideas about God are wrong and we don't recognize him as he has showed himself to be, our ideas on how to live a life that pleases God will also be wrong. If we miss God's mercy and his compassion, we're going to be hard and uncaring toward people. And our lives will be full of bitterness instead of joy. And we will miss God's heart of love for people. If we miss giving thanks and praise to God as he deserves it, if we put our ideas ahead of God's, we will simply miss what we have been made for. I'd like to pray for us. Our Father, I thank you so much for your heart of love. Yes, you have laws, you have things that you put out that you want people to do, but the real point is to love you first and to love each other as we would love ourselves. Father, I thank you that you are so common sense. You are so just sensible. How can we say that? Thank you. Thank you so much for who Jesus is and that you have shown yourself to us. Help us to understand how we apply this in our lives today. Strengthen us to be like you, to have your heart for people around us, and for loving and praising you. In Jesus' name, amen. If you have any questions or would like to contact me, remember my contact information is on the Golden Prairie Community Church website. I would like to end with a benediction, Romans 11, verses 33 to 36. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways! For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Or who has given a gift to him that might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. Have a great week.